Good morning. If you would, please take out your handouts. Lesson number 17, overview of Numbers. Stephen ably closed out our study of Leviticus on Wednesday, and now we are going to move into Numbers, get our typical overview. Then we're going to spend 2 lessons looking at kind of the big picture of the book next time, and then the following lesson we'll look at some connections to the rest of the Pentateuch and even into the rest of the Bible. As we start out the book of Numbers, I think of the books in the Pentateuch, Numbers is one that we have one highlight story, but we really don't spend a whole lot of time talking about Numbers. We probably spend most of our time when we think about the Pentateuch in Genesis, Exodus, and maybe a little bit of Deuteronomy, and if we can sprinkle in a little bit of Leviticus here and there, particularly the Nadab and Abihu story, and then the rebellion story in Numbers. And so we kind of have a grading, and I understand why, because the more narrative in the first 2 there. But I want us to think through some of the ideas in the book of Numbers that go beyond just the rebellion, but I think that is the key theme. And so let's start with the title of the book. Again, this is page 35. The English title Numbers comes from the Greek. You can see our word arithmetic in the Greek word there for numbers, and from the Latin, you even see our word number there. Why do you suppose Jews and Christians gave Numbers the title Numbers?
It begins with taking a census. God let Moses and Aaron take a census. So that's how it begins with numbers.
Very good. So it starts off with a numbering of the people. We have another numbering of the people later on in the book, but that's how it starts, and that's seemingly why it would have gotten this name. Do you think that's a good description of the book of Numbers? All right, so it does give us a good description of the beginning.
I mean, we've got, as you mentioned, more than one census, and we even have several passages. I don't know if this was in their mind, but it seems like we have several passages where we have significant numbers highlighted. The numbers of the various offerings, 2 silver trumpets, 40 years in the wilderness, 12 spies. So, I don't know, maybe I'm going overboard there, but there are a lot of numbers in the book of Numbers.
Yeah, I think it capably describes various contents within the book. Any other thoughts on that?
Just that we don't boil it down just to numbers, as if, we go to the Bible and try to put a description on each book, and like, oh, this is just a book about numbers. Well, there's a whole lot of theological concepts that are attached to those numbers. The sovereignty of God, the holiness of God, what the land allotment. I mean, there was reasons why God numbered. So I think we need to make sure we go deeper than just, well, this is a book about numbers. That would be a con, maybe, if we could put it there.
Yeah, and I think Numbers is a fine title. It's kind of like the book of Leviticus. It's not just for the Levites. There's a lot more to it than just what the Levites need to know. I think there's a lot more to the book of Numbers, but it definitely captures some of the key concepts in the book of Numbers. The census may or may not be the primary focus of the book. If you were to say what is the primary focus of the book of Numbers, what would you say?
Wandering in the wilderness.
Wandering in the wilderness. So if we were to attach that to some of the Bible periods that we sometimes describe, this would definitely fit within that wandering in the wilderness concept. And so, but I don't know if wandering or wilderness would necessarily be as catchy a title as the book of Numbers. And so I think this is a valid description. I did give you the Hebrew title for the book of Numbers, and that is In the Wilderness. Sorry, was there a comment? Okay. In the wilderness, that's a pretty good description of, geographically, maybe even spiritually, what's happening in the book of Numbers. But either way, I think this, as long as we get a picture of God is fulfilling his promises, and you see that in the census, you see the results of their rebellion, not only in their lowering of the numbers, but also in the place where they have to wander for 40 years. We get a pretty good picture from these titles of what is happening in the book of Numbers. Any additional thoughts on that description of this book?
A couple of other titles that I ran across was book of journeyings or the book of murmurings, and all of those fitly describe some of the events that take place in the book. And I don't think there's one title that you could name the book that would aptly describe what the book is truly about.
Yeah, most titles, of course, as we've talked about, nearly all titles would be man-made. The only possible differences there might be the book of Psalms, or that even doesn't necessarily do justice, but Proverbs, these are the Proverbs of, that kind of gives its own title. But really, most titles, even if you take the first line in, say, a prophecy or an epistle, it doesn't really tell you much about what the book is about. It tells you to who gave the prophecy, who wrote it, to whom it was written. When we get to these narrative books where we're trying to give a title to it, we have to do the best we can with one word. And I think Numbers or In the Wilderness are fine titles. All right, again, this is repeat question, number 4. But second section here, who wrote Numbers? Moses. All right. Look at, I will note Numbers 12. Numbers 12. We have discussed how, for instance, the end of the book of Deuteronomy may have been written by Joshua or something along those lines. When you have these narrative sections, for instance, 12 and verse 3, now the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. I would just note that it is definitely possible that Moses wrote this himself, this parenthetical statement. It could also be Joshua, just like the Deuteronomy. So, maybe we can be careful with that joke just to say, hey, Moses had to write about his own humility. We have this whole book, the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Moses is the writer, but we do have some sections that could have been by Joshua or Samuel or something along those lines. And so when we have this picture of Moses is the primary author of Numbers, if not of all of it, we need to remember to whom he is writing primarily. And so to whom did Moses write Numbers? Think about where this book ends, so who would be the recipients of this book?
Those that did not die in the wilderness, they're going into the land of Canaan.
Yes, and why is it significant to remember that Moses wrote this book, and he wrote it to the second generation of Israelites?
Well, a number of the highlights in the book have to do with rebellion against God's authority in general and Moses' authority in particular. So this second generation needs to remember every time an instruction comes from Joshua, who will be appointed as Moses' successor, you cannot buck against that authority. Every time somebody comes to you and says, now, remember what Moses told us, you have to take that seriously.
Absolutely. This is setting the stage for you're about to go into a land. They were about to go into a land. What are you going to do? Are you going to walk in the same steps as those who went before you and failed and were laid low in the wilderness?
Can you just imagine if you didn't have that information, and then God tells you to walk around this city 7 times, or for 7 days, and as compared to knowing, okay, they didn't go in when they should have, and then they tried to go in, God told them, don't, you've already failed, and they were destroyed. It just, it had to, every step had to be, as they were walking around Jericho, thinking about that.
Absolutely. And I do think this is the primary point that needs to be made, is that Moses was writing this so that the next generation would know how they need to act when they are going into the land. However, I would add that with any Bible book, is it only for that generation who first received it? Why would the subsequent generations need to read this book from Moses? Even the ones who are already in the land. Maintain faithfulness. And if we keep reading the narrative, the story, we go from this generation failed. this book was written for the second generation. You don't want to fail the way the first generation did. Now, what happens when you get a couple generations later? The people at the time of Judges should have went back and read the book of Numbers, and they did not. They failed. And then you see restoration, if you will, with various peoples as you work through the history of Israel. But Moses did not necessarily just write for that second generation because they had it in living memory. It was also for their children and their children's children to look back and say, we will not fail the way the first generation did. And sadly, many of them did fail. Any additional thoughts on authorship, provenance? All right. The next section, still under section 2 there, the events of Numbers are not recorded in chronological order, and I give you a footnote there. For those who have been in the class before, you know that we mentioned a Hebrew construction that just says, and then this happened, and then this happened. Same thing happens in the book of Numbers. It's like it's just picking up on Leviticus or Exodus chronologically or story-wise. And so it's just, here's the next thing that happened. Numbers is the next in the sequence of this big book of Genesis through Deuteronomy. But it's not written in strictly chronological order, even though it's continuing the story. So Numbers begins with the first of the second month in the second year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, Numbers 1:1. Then it eventually returns to the day that Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle, which we learn is going to be before that first section in 1:1. And then it moves to the first month of the 14th day, on the 14th day of the month, Numbers 9 and verse 5. But we have this difference in sequence chronologically, probably for thematic reasons. We'll come back to that in just a moment. However, I think we could say that just like the Gospels, where it basically starts with either the birth of Jesus or the beginning of his ministry and ends with resurrection, and things in between are not necessarily chronological, so we have that in the book of Numbers. We're working toward the second generation on the cusp of entering into the land, starting here with after Leviticus and the reception of these various laws in Exodus and Leviticus. But though we are working in generally chronological fashion, we do see that it's slightly out of sequence. Moses was not required to write in chronological order. He had a reason for moving out of sequence, but he's still telling that story. And I think it's going to be important for us to see how this story works. Why do you suppose the author does not record the events of Numbers in chronological order? Why does Moses do this for the second generation? Why have this out of order, if you will? These are always the tougher questions where you have to kind of think through why do that?
Some of the times that these things happen is that they have a sequence of things they want to cover, you get it all in, and then they go back and pick up something else that maybe didn't necessarily fit in the discussion he was making.
Very good. Any other thoughts?
When we're writing a sermon, we don't always put things in order. We have different things that we feel like, hey, this is significant that we need to deal with, which will then lead to that point. So perhaps there's some of that going on.
Yep. And on that point, I would point out that sometimes the way we view history is you're writing history in sequence. I would say that not even all history books are going to write in chronological sequence, but they didn't write history the way we do. And we've already noted that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus are not primarily just this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. It's not just a history of God's people. It's a selected history of God's people. He's trying to tell them something they needed to hear that is not necessarily just this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. Now, those things did happen. We're not talking about some myth that is not based in fact. We're talking about history, but selecting various parts and then changing the sequence as needed in order to tell the story that Moses wants to tell. He is not playing fast and loose with what really happened, But what he is trying to do is he's trying to set things in a way that proves a point. I think what he's doing is he starts with this concept of census. He moves on to concepts of purity. Then you have preparation of the tabernacle, which leads to rebellion. Then what do you have? You have a census then you move on to offerings, which is related to purity, and then you're talking about a land inheritance. And so I think he is putting things in a sequence so that he can say, God numbered them. He kept his promises. They needed to maintain purity before God. Then he would be in his presence would be among them. They squander that privilege. And so what happens? After they, just like in Sinai, break the covenant, if you will, he is going to renew his promises by taking another census so that they can then maintain his presence and actually come into the promised land where God promises to be with his people. So I think that may be my reading of it, but I think there is something to the sequence of how the chapters work together, of why he pushes things into different order, is because he's just telling the same story twice so that the people can recognize that they are part of this story and they need to maintain purity so that the presence of God will be in the land with them. All right, any additional thoughts on that? All right, section number 3, what is the big story, the theme of Numbers? I've used this phrase, big story, biggest story, but in essence, what is the theme of the book of Numbers? I don't think it's just counting or numbers, even though that's an adequate description of the contents. What do you think is the theme of the book of Numbers?
Largely a story of faithlessness and rebellion and consequences that come because of that.
Very good. I'm going to hold on to that. Faithlessness and rebellion. Does anyone have any additional thoughts there? God is holy.
Can't ignore that rebellion.
Can't ignore that rebellion. Any other thoughts?
God is faithful while the people were unfaithful. The consequences of that don't diminish.
Absolutely. So putting all those together, I was kind of leaning toward Chris's idea there. To borrow Paul's language with Timothy, he is faithful. If we deny him, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. And so we have this faithfulness of God running through. That's really almost the theme of the entire Old Testament, is the faithfulness of God being demonstrated, which then I think the book of Romans is basically culminating that idea of Christ is the ultimate picture of God's faithfulness that's been a theme all the way through.
There's kind of a turning point from after they sinned because of the spies. They didn't have confidence that God could give them the land. And so when we look at chapter 14, start with verse 20 or 31, God tells them, well, okay, you've sinned, the older generation's not going to go into the promised land. And so it almost seems to me there's a separation. The young people can because they're innocent, but below 20, but the older ones will not see the promised land. Does that seem right?
Yeah, there's definitely a turning point. In fact, we'll deal with that in this next section a little bit more, but I think that's definitely a turning point. And I'll even bring up now the concept that I've kind of seen running through each of these books. If we see Moses as the author of Genesis through Deuteronomy, and each of these kind of relating what Israel needs to hear, Genesis kind of has multiple rebellions that are turning points. You have Adam and Eve, you have the Noah generation, then there's probably some more we could look at Genesis. I think those are the big two. But then you get into the book of Exodus. What do you have? Rebellion at Sinai, turning point in the book. Then in Leviticus, you have the priestly rebellion with Nadab and Abihu, turning point in the book. Numbers, you have the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea. You have turning point in the book. And then Deuteronomy is looking back at all that and saying, don't rebel. It's almost like emphatically he's saying, rebellion, rebellion, rebellion. And guess what? God has been faithful to his promises all the way through that. So you got to decide, are you going to be on the side of faithfulness or on the side of unfaithfulness? Good point. Any other thoughts? All right. Why did the original recipients need to hear this big story of Numbers? Rebellion of Israel, faithfulness of God, holiness of God.
Well, the younger generation had seen, their parents, grandparents die off in the wilderness. And I think they needed to know that being faithful to God as they're going into the land to take it, that you can come through those trials and be successful. Because if you stay with God, God will be with you.
Very good. Any other thoughts?
It makes me think of from archaeological studies. We've seen that nations of this time would capture historical events that matter to them in stone or in wood or various places around their camp, their communities. And now they've been in the wilderness without that, largely, and now they're going into this new land without that. It's full of all sorts of other kind of archaeological markers from other nations. And this is something they can take into this new land, a scroll that contains history and teaching and these lessons that can be that for them, be the lessons for them.
Absolutely. Very good. Any other thoughts?
I wonder too if part of it is the fact that the consequence doesn't just fall on you. For your unfaithfulness, everybody pays. Which we really see that when after they conquer the land and Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh are going back across Jordan and they build that altar and it incites a panic. And the rest of it, hey, listen, it's okay, just come back over here, let's all be faithful together, because if y'all are unfaithful, it's going to fall upon all of us. So I wonder if that's not part of it as well.
And I would add to that, doesn't that kind of take the sting away from people who go, how in the world could God destroy an entire family with the failure at Ai? First hurt the whole nation and then destroy a whole family. Haven't they had 5 books already telling them, you're going to affect everybody else with your sin? This is not something new to Achan. He should have known by all the stories that have been told up to this point, recorded for them in the scroll of Moses. You need to listen because there are collective national consequences for sin. And it doesn't seem like anybody looks at the collective punishment and says, yeah, they didn't deserve it. Because sin affects the camp. It affects everyone. All right. Any additional thoughts there? All right. Then let's go to section number 4 here. Page 36, just as the rebellion at Sinai divides Exodus 19 through 40 into 2 major sections, the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea divides Numbers into 2 major sections. The first major section in Numbers is 1 through 14. Skim through Numbers 1 through 14 and provide a heading or a single sentence summary of it. What did you come up with for this first half of Numbers, 1 through 14?
The first generation travels to Canaan but loses faith.
Very good. Everybody agree with that, or do you have anything else? I had something similar to that. I had just preparation and rebellion. So preparation to enter and or to depart and head to the land of Canaan, and then rebellion when it's offered to them. What about the second section, 15 through 36? What did you come up with for kind of the main point in that second half after the rebellion?
The older generation dies off while the younger generation prepares to go in and take the land.
Very good. And so, that kind of fit a nice little envelope for me, is that you have preparation, rebellion, punishment, preparation. And so we have this kind of sequence of events where the first generation should have been prepared to enter, and they failed. The second generation is going to, quote unquote, suffer the consequences. The first generation is going to fall in the wilderness. The second generation is going to have to wait. But then they come up to the east side of the Jordan, and they are preparing to enter the land there in Moab, and then getting ready for everything that will happen as they enter past the River Jordan. I did offer that you didn't have to take my twofold division of Numbers. Did anyone come up with any other way to outline the book of Numbers?
I will admit that beyond those two major subdivisions, the interspersal of things that, it's like, if I could take these 3 chapters and leave, or these 4 chapters and leave one of them out, I could have one consistent theme, but they'll drop in a chapter of laws that sometimes I struggle to see if there's a flow of thought there.
Right, and we may touch on some of those whenever we get to the second lesson and kind of see how some things break down there. Any additional thoughts? All right, so before we get to making connections to the New Testament, I would just remind us that basically now we have kind of a big picture with a title of this starts with a census, it has another census, this is God's numbering of his people, which symbolizes the fulfillment of his promises to Abraham, and these are the events that occur in the wilderness. Now, what happens in the wilderness is that they have come to the land. They are right on the edge. They are prepared to go in, and they fail. And they disregard the faithfulness of God, and thus their faithlessness keeps them out of the land. And so this second generation needed to hear this story, had to retain this story for not only them, but also for their children, of this is what it looks like whenever we fail to obey God. And the reason I think this is all significant is because it points forward to the New Testament, and the New Testament authors even are going to pick up some of these themes. And there's one that I don't have in section 5 that I want to point to because I think it is an important kind of concept for seeing the significance of Numbers even today. Look at the little book of Jude. The book of Jude. I think this is why it is significant for us today to keep kind of this picture of Numbers in our mind. I'd like to begin reading in verse 3. Jude, verse 3. Beloved, while I was making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing to you that you contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all handed down to the saints. For certain persons have crept in unnoticed, those who long beforehand were marked out for this condemnation, ungodly persons who turn the grace of God into licentiousness and deny our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ. Let me pause there for just a second. Doesn't that sound relevant? I want to write to you about our common salvation. I've got to tell you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. Why? Because there are false teachers coming in who are turning the grace of God into a license for sin and are thereby denying their only Lord and Master, Jesus Christ. Now, who is the Lord and Master here? Jesus. There are people who are subverting the gospel. He says you need to contend for the faith. How does he prove that? Verse 5. Now I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all. Notice there's that same once for all language. The faith has been once for all delivered. Now you know all things once for all. He says that the Lord, your translation, if you're using an ESV or NET, may say Jesus. That's a difference in manuscripts there. But that the Lord, well, who was the Lord in the previous verse? Jesus. So either way, we're talking about Jesus, whether it says Lord or whether it says Jesus. Jesus, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. He is taking the book of Numbers and saying, this is how it applies to our time in the gospel. He is saying there are false teachers who are among you who are subverting the faith. And he says, what did Jesus do with those people back there? They were faithless. They were laid low in the wilderness. Same thing is illustrated in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 as well. And then he goes through several other examples of people who did not remain in the proper domain, angels, people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then in verse 8 he says, and yet in the same way, these men, who? The ones who are coming in and subverting the gospel, who by dreaming defile the flesh and reject authority and revile angelic majesties. And so then you have the rest of the book just about saying, here are what these false teachers are like. What's the first example he gives? What's it look like when people are saved by God and then reject God? He says Numbers is the key example. It is ruining everything that happened in Exodus for that generation. He says it's going to ruin everything for your exodus from sin if you go along in the same act of rebellion and unbelief. And so what does he tell them? He says, you remember the words of the apostles, you keep yourselves in the love of God, and God's going to keep you from stumbling. And so there are going to be various occasions where we see this concept of numbers and the story of numbers brought forward into the New Testament. And I want to just look at 5 of them. And if you didn't have time to read through these, I'm going to rely heavily on those who did, just for time's sake. But the New Testament occasionally alludes to numbers. Read the following passages in Numbers and their possible counterparts in the New Testament, and indicate in the blank cell in the table why the New Testament references the passage in Numbers. So we have Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 through 6. We could tie that to John chapter 6, verses 31 through 33. And what connection did you see there as you compared those two passages?
And Jesus is the true bread of life. I'll supply the manna to the children of Israel, but Jesus is our true source of life.
Very good. And how did the Jews in Numbers 11, the Israelites in Numbers 11, respond to God giving bread from heaven? They complained. How are the Jews in John 6 responding to the bread of heaven? The same way. They're making all the claims that we're not like our fathers. And then they're acting just like their fathers in a far more consequential way. That they are rejecting the bread of heaven. They're complaining that it is not what they wanted. It doesn't fit the bill as they would see it. Any other thoughts there?
In John 4, why woman at the well, Jesus refers to as living waters. Almost seems to me that would be the same type of thing, in the sense it's a spiritual food and not where it's spiritual drink as opposed to something physical.
Very good, yeah. They're missing the point of all those stories that they could have seen in the Old Testament pointing forward to Jesus. All right, what about Numbers 12 and verse 7 compared to Hebrews 3 and verse 5? What is Numbers?
As you're saying, Numbers 12:7, you basically have Moses being elevated above all other prophets. God says, he is faithful, I speak with him mouth to mouth. And then in Hebrews, though, the point is, Moses was faithful, but he was still a servant. And now we have the Son.
So, should we look at that and say because Jesus is the Son, Moses was unimportant, or that what number says is just kind of, we can just dismiss that? No, it's saying if Moses is here, where does that put Jesus? Way up here. Same concept is brought forward into 2 Corinthians chapter 3. You see the glory of the old law? Look how much more the new covenant. All right. What about Numbers 14, 26 through 35 as compared with Hebrews 3, 7 through 11? And we do kind of have a transition text in Hebrews 3 of Psalm 95. But what comparison do you see there?
I rejected the rebels of Israel when they refused to embrace Canaan. Embrace, that is to say, accept his blessing, embrace the promise that he gave. Likewise will reject the recipients of that letter, including us, if we refuse to embrace the promise that he has given to us, Christ.
Very good. And for those who had been in Egypt and had wandered in the wilderness, Canaan was supposed to be rest. They rejected it. So, as Brad pointed out, there is also a Sabbath rest waiting for us. What are we going to do? I think I've preached on this before, but in Hebrews chapter 4 as well, it almost, 3 and 4 put together, it's almost like we have a picture of kind of a double meaning there where you have, if Joshua had given them rest, well, Joshua is the same name for Jesus, and so we have this picture of if Jesus had given them rest, which he didn't, but he entered into rest, we are looking to follow Jesus into the true rest of God. So in essence, don't act faithlessly like that first generation did. Otherwise, you will be cut off from the rest, the promised land of rest that is waiting for you. Numbers 20, 10 through 13, compared with 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4. What comparison do we have there?
Spiritual order with physical order.
Very good. And why do you think 1 Corinthians 10 brings that up?
Well, there's a danger for rejecting Christ, just like there was for a danger of rejecting the law that Moses handed down.
Very good. And maybe even taking it another step, who were the first generation of Israelites rejecting? Jesus. He was the rock, and they rejected him. So he's telling the Corinthians, you are now in the same lineage as those people. You are now sons of Abraham. What are you going to do? Are you going to reject Christ the same way that they rejected Christ? And finally, Numbers 21, 8 and 9, connected with John 3, 14 and 15. What story do we have there alluded to and explained in John 3?
The fact that Christ would be lifted up in order to give us eternal life to those who believe.
And Jesus was going to be lifted up just as what had been lifted up? A serpent in the wilderness, the bronze serpent that had been raised up. I have not given enough thought to this, but I do think it is interesting that a serpent is lifted up in Numbers, and then we could see that that even becomes a cause for stumbling. Where do we also, we had a serpent back in Genesis 3, we have a serpent in Genesis 21. That serpent then become what was that picture of salvation from the serpents that come in has become a means of idolatry. And now what do we have? We have one who's going to be lifted up, who is going to destroy the ultimate serpent from the past. And so we have this picture of Jesus, and he even uses the phrase, Son of Man. It almost sounds like we have a new Adam on the scene who is going to provide relief to the people that from the serpent who has been causing them ill this entire time. I'm not going to spend time on Numbers 24:17. There's possible link with the star in Matthew 2:2. But I want to read the application very quickly in Deuteronomy 8:2 and 3. Depending on how kind the bell ringer is to me, I might have time to read this. Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 and 3 says, "You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He humbled you and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of God." God tested the Israelites in the wilderness to determine whether they would obey his law. He permitted them to hunger and fed them only manna so that they would learn to trust his word. Do we become bitter when God allows us to face hardship, or do we learn to rely on him? What hardships are you facing, and how can it help you draw near to God? Something to think about this week. If you would, go ahead and prepare for lesson number 18, and we'll cover that on Wednesday, Lord willing.